Hi, I'm Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy, and I'm here today with Karen Pryor. Thanks, Karen, for joining me for this dialogue.
You're very welcome. I'm glad to be talking with you.
So I want to start off by introducing you. You're a professor of English at the Liberty University, which I see here is the largest university in Virginia and the largest Christian university in the world. Is that right?
Yes, we have a very large online program which numbers over 100,000 students, but our residential campus includes 13,000 undergraduates there on campus. So
Oh, wow.
that's
So
pretty much.
yeah, it's pretty big. So you're also the author of numerous books, and I see that it looks like the current one is Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, who is a poet, reformer, and abolitionist. And I understand you're also working on another book too, which we'll talk about in a little while.
Right. Well, The Fierce Convictions is the book that I'm just finishing up and that's coming out, and that's the book where I talk about some empathy-related subjects. Yes.
Oh, okay, great. And another thing is I just looked up your bio on your staff page, and it says you live in rural Virginia along with your husband and a sundry of dogs, horses, and chickens,
Yes.
and that you were a prior member of the Faith Advisory Council for the Humane Society.
Right, right. I am, and we'll talk a little bit more about animal welfare and how that's connected to empathy too this afternoon, I hope.
Great. Well, what we wanted to talk about is you wrote an article called "Empathically Correct is the new Empathically Correct is the new I can't even pronounce that, politically correct. Boy, I'm having trouble pronouncing that. Politically correct. There we go. So I was thinking as we could go through your article, just kind of step by step, and maybe hear the different parts of it. And I kind of made an outline here, and just kind of discuss it, hear what you had to say about it, and maybe we just have a little dialogue about some of the parts, arguments that you make. Does that work?
That sounds good. Yes.
Good. Well, you start off in your article by saying that political correctness was big on the 80s and 90s. And I think, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that, like what
Sure.
political correctness was and what that means to you.
Well, the movement of political correctness, called later PC, started in universities, of course, and I was in graduate school at a large state university when the movement was really getting momentum. And of course, political correctness is a pejorative term, but the beginnings of political correctness, and much of it actually, I think, has good intentions and a good purpose, and that was, of course, to broaden perspectives to include previously marginalized and oppressed peoples and perspectives. So in my discipline, which is English literature, that often meant expanding the canon of Western literature to include voices that would not have been included before. But sometimes that could go to an extreme. It could mean, for example, one of the things that happened is that the Shakespeare requirement in a lot of English programs got thrown out, so students were no longer even studying Shakespeare. And so it went to an extreme of not just including marginalized peoples and voices, but throwing out the great traditions along with it. And so, I was there for the growth and some of the worst excesses of political correctness, and so that reminded me of this new trend that seems to be coming out of some universities that I call empathetic correctness.
Yeah, so you're kind of coining a new term, empathetic correctness. I haven't heard that term before, so would you say you're kind of coining that term?
I think that I did. I talked about it with my editor at The Atlantic. I looked to see if anyone had used the term, and I couldn't find it, so I'm not necessarily saying that I did, but I hadn't heard it before and I haven't seen it. So yes, I believe that I coined the term there.
Okay. Oh yeah, and I didn't mention that the article came out in the Atlantic, so that's where I saw the article. So would you like to just talk about, well, what are you in kind of in broad terms? What are you how are you defining empathetic correctness?
Well, and of course, I am using the term in a pejorative way, in the way that political correctness is used now, which is not to say that I think that empathy is a bad thing, and we'll talk about that more, I hope. Of course, empathy is a good thing, but empathetic correctness is what I see as taking an impulse toward empathy to an extreme that really may be more damaging than helpful. And so where I see this coming is this new trend that was reported on recently in the New York Times of a number of universities, often at the behest of students, who are proposing that so-called trigger warnings be placed on course syllabi or texts that contain material that might trigger responses, negative reactions in students. Now, the term trigger warnings is new to a lot of people, and trigger warnings originated really in the blogosphere, often on feminist websites or websites that deal with rape and abuse. And so writers on those sites would often include so-called trigger warnings to warn their readers that they're going to talk about these sensitive issues that can often trigger symptoms like those we see in post-traumatic stress disorder, which is often something that we usually associate with war veterans. So there is a legitimate place for trigger warnings with extremely traumatized people who are suffering from PT, post-traumatic stress disorder. But in these examples cited in the New York Times story, students were often who had not experienced trauma themselves but were concerned for other students, want to see trigger warnings placed on all kinds of literary works, on documentary films. So for some examples that were cited by students were included the anti-Semitism in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, the misogynistic violence in The Great Gatsby. And so I saw it as just sort of ironic that, especially in the English literature curriculum, I mean, most English majors really are pushing for to read cutting edge literature, to read challenging literature. And this is really an opposite impulse where students are wanting to be protected from challenging or disturbing material. And I tied that with other things going on in our culture right now. The term empathy jumped out at me in a column written by E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post in following a Supreme Court ruling about public prayer. He disagreed with the ruling which allowed sectarian prayer in public meetings, and he said that the ruling failed the empathy test. And by that he was talking about what it feels like to be a minority or practice a minority religion in our country, and to be subjected to the public exercise of religion by the majority. I think that's an abuse of the term empathy, actually, because I think that we can feel empathy and should respond with empathy, but we shouldn't make constitutional rights dependent upon empathy because it's so subjective and can change so frequently. The minority can become the majority very quickly. So I'm concerned about empathy not being, which is very subjective, personal, and individualized, not being tied to external subjective things like rights and duties that are all agreed upon by society.
So I guess that kind of brings up the question for me is how are you defining the word empathy? Because I've interviewed people like Dan Batson, who's one of the big researchers around empathy, studying it for 30, 40 years. And he's laid out all the different ways that it's used, and it's a bit of there's so many different definitions, and it keeps getting stretched and pulled in different directions. And he basically says, well, there's no right and wrong way in that sense, except when you first start your conversation, it might be good to say how you're using the term and kind of stick with that term so you at least know what we're talking about. And maybe if you shared your definition, I could share mine. We could have kind of like a little baseline to dialogue from.
No, I think, of course, definition of terms is important in any discussion, let alone something that might evolve into a debate or something divisive. And of course, empathy. I mean, and as someone who studies English language and literature, of course, I love definitions, and I think they're very important to agree upon. And so my working definition of empathy is just a simple, basic dictionary definition. I'm sure there are complications, but I understand empathy to be to refer to the ability to relate to the feelings of others. Are there many more definitions than that?
Yeah, well, let me share. I've talked to a lot of people about empathy, so I've kind of put together my own little typology of how I see the term being used. That kind of helps me. And so I'm seeing like four general components of empathy. The first one is something that's not talked about a lot, but is self-empathy, which is a sensory awareness of what's going on inside of us. That's our own, being aware of our own felt experience. The second is what I'm calling mirrored empathy. The academics sometimes call it affective or emotional empathy, and that's through mirror neurons. When we see an action and do an action, the same neurons fire in us. So as I wave my hands around here, you've got neurons that are kind of firing to, kind of like mirror those actions, and so that's kind of this mirroring of emotions and feelings. And then there's an imaginative empathy, which is through self-awareness that we have, which is we can imagine ourselves in other people's situations. So I can imagine myself, being an animal, or being you, or I can imagine myself in the future, in a sense. I'm kind of, or in conflict, sometimes you do, role playing and imagine yourself in someone else's situation, or even actors imagine themselves in someone else's situation. And the academics seem to call that cognitive empathy or perspective taking. I like the word imaginative empathy, because we kind of imagine, we imagine ourselves in someone else's situation. And then the fourth part would be an empathic creativity or action, which is that if I connect with you and we really start resonating, that the quality of the action that happens has a quality of connection to it. Instead of me telling you what to do, that we're kind of holding each other's values and needs and taking this action together. And you see this creativity sometimes happen when people are in dialogue, and then they kind of come to an agreement and take some action. So that's the basic framework of how I'm using the term. I'm just wondering how that kind of resonates with you.
Right. I think that all of those different facets of empathy actually do connect to the basic definition that I've used, because all of them have in common identification. Whether it's identification with your own feelings or identification with another through imagination or action, I do think that at root, those are all forms of being able to identify the emotional experience of self or other. So I think we're pretty much on the same page. You just have a much more highly developed and nuanced approach, and you are an expert in this. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. So yeah, I see that too. You can say, well, it's feeling your way into someone else's experience. You can start breaking it down to a whole typology of what that really means. And so I've just that's kind of like just kind of a working definition that I find helpful. So let's see. So what I was hearing is that you were saying that empathy is a positive feeling, that even political correctness was something beneficial, but that it's kind of been taken to the extreme in some way. It's kind of the sense is what I'm hearing, and that's what you're kind of objecting to is kind of this.
Right. I mean, I see in this a movement toward imposing trigger warnings on course material used by college students to allow them to either avoid the material or prepare themselves for the material. And again, I'm not saying that none of them should be there, and that we should not, that we should ignore the real trauma that can occur in people who have post-traumatic stress disorder or have experienced extreme abuse and so forth. And I talk about one of those experiences that I had with a student in the article. But
that was with the rape victim.
Yeah, yes, a rape victim who was troubled by a Victorian novel we were reading in the class discussions going along with that. And so I did work through that with her. But I think I'm not sure how helpful a trigger warning would have been if she had been able to just simply avoid the material rather than confront it within the controlled environment, the nurturing environment of a classroom, and then in my office where I was able to connect her to the proper kinds of help. But what I really see at work here is a paradox, because as I talk about in my article, a number of recent studies are showing or confirming that one of the values that of great literature, literary fiction in particular, is that it does cultivate empathy in the readers. A study came out recently, another one. There have been several of them confirming that. And so there's this paradox of, in the name of empathy, avoiding troubling, disturbing material, when often it's our exposure to that, our reading of great literary works, or exposure to new ideas or facts. I think about documentary films and so forth. Our exposure to those things actually can cultivate further empathy in us. And so, in the name of empathy, to avoid something for oneself or to allow others to avoid something that is unsettling or disturbing, I think that our empathy may turn in on it ourselves and prevent us from actually being able to have empathy with others if we're so focused on our own sort of highly individualized, personalized trauma.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like that sense of protecting. It's kind of like protecting. You're needing to protect, and that protection is maybe even inhibiting more empathy, which,
right, exactly.
I mean, often when people are in fear, right, they kind of close down, they shut off, and they lose connection with others. And so what I'm hearing a little bit, what I'm tell me if I'm correct, is what you're really concerned is about coddling. Maybe would be is that someone is coddled, which I looked up the definition, is to treat in an indulgent or overprotective way, to pamper. So that instead of really exposing people to multiple experiences, that there's, they're being overly protected. It's not like, I was hearing a sense of care. You had a real sense of care for the person. The person had been raped and all what she was going through, but it's like you're also wanting a sense of care, but not like overprotection.
Right, exactly. And of course, that raises other issues that I didn't get into in my article that I just alluded to, as you just did, which is, of course, that we have an entire generation of that's coming into college now that has been raised by what we in academia call helicopter parents. Now, I'm speaking in general terms here, but we do have a generation that many different studies and articles and anecdotal evidence have shown have been coddled, to use your term. So that is a concern that goes beyond this particular issue. And so, I don't think it's a coincidence that this trigger warning issue is coming out of this particular generation. Now, I do want to clarify, I heard from another student, a former student of mine, who also is a victim of rape, and she shared with me experiences she had in her graduate years, where she had professors who assigned material that resulted in trauma for her, and she was glad that she read the material, was exposed to the material, but she felt that those particular classrooms and the conversations she had with those particular professors didn't take her needs as much into consideration as they should have. And so she shared these ideas with me after my article came out. And so I do believe that, rather than trigger warnings, I think that all of us in academia, or even, wherever we are as adults, we need to have an awareness that this generation of students perhaps is expecting more coddling. That doesn't mean that we need to give that to them, but they are expecting it. We need to meet them where they are. And that we also have more and more students who are coming to college who perhaps in previous generations never even would have been there. And so we have to recognize that there is a greater need for sensitivity to these issues. I don't know, and of course this is a question that's raised all the time, whether we actually have more abuse than before, or just there's more awareness of abuse. But regardless of which is correct, we have in our classrooms and eventually in our workplaces more young people who are the victims of abuse and are dealing with it and coping with it, and we need to be sensitive to that. So if anything has come out of this discussion that I think is valuable, is that we need to be aware, and we need to find ways of coping with it and helping those students, even if that's not the use of trigger warnings, which I would prefer that we don't use those.
Well, for me, it's
We
like,
need to have empathy.
that's what I think too, is like the antidote is empathy. Like if someone who has gone through abuse and, you know, post-traumatic stress, what usually happens is people disconnect from the world. They become isolated within themselves. And for them to have an opportunity to be in dialogue and to share what their experiences are is like the healing antidote to that experience. And to have kind of safe environment to be able to share in a, you know, non-threatening way is actually seems to me to be the way of reconnecting people and to do that that healing, I guess, for a better word.
Right, exactly. And so that environment of trust and empathy on the part that a professor or an employer or whoever needs to cultivate is of foremost importance. And I think if we were doing that and focusing on that, then we could continue to offer this challenging course material, this education that takes us out of our comfort zones and expands our understanding of the world and ourselves. And we can do that without trigger warnings, as long as we're prepared to meet those needs with empathy.
Yeah, I guess what comes to me is instead of you know, like empathically correct, it might be coddling correctness or something like that. You know what I'm saying? It's like, it's not the empathy. I'm just kind of concerned, like, empathy is going to get this bad rap in a sense. It's not the empathy that is the problem. It is, one, it's the abuse that people have maybe gone through, or it's the overprotection that people have gone through.
Right.
And that actually empathy, I mean, I don't see coddling as empathic. You know, it's you know, coddling someone is to just kind of be overly controlling and overly protective, and it's really not even engaging in an honest, perhaps empathic dialogue. You know.
Right. No, I appreciate that you offered to have this conversation, because I understand that of course we don't want to make empathy a bad word, but you know, the parallel with political correctness, politics are wonderful. I love politics. And so the term political correctness puts a different spin on it, but so it's really, my emphasis is on the phrase, the term correctness. That you know, empathetic correctness is not the same thing as empathy.
Is that like the correctness part is like coercion? It's more like political coercion or empathic coercion. So you're actually, what I'm hearing is maybe the objection is to coerce people, and it's that coercion, which, and for me, coercion is not empathic, because
right, exactly. It's paradoxical again. Exactly. So that was really what I was thinking in coining that term and placing those terms in juxtaposition like that. It's a ridiculous notion in the term, but also in, again, the paradox that I pointed to in trying to be overly, you know, in trying to be so empathetic that you're closing yourself off to reading and challenge, then paradoxically you are actually, ultimately we will lose empathy.
Yeah, so it's what I'm hearing there is that people say, oh, we have to, empathy is hearing others, we have to protect ourselves, and that creating that sense of protection is actually inhibiting more empathy. So it's not really about protecting ourselves, but creating maybe an empathic you know, space where people can really have like true and honest dialogue with each other and really hear each other, and not and maybe have that sense of safety, but not have that coercion that, you know, we're not going to tell you this, or we're not going to be open and not be honest.
Right, exactly. So the trigger warning circumvents all that. It's a little easy, it's an easy fix, but I think in the long run it's damaging to the ultimate goal, which is not only empathy, but even overall, you know, human flourishing. So to get people who have experienced trauma beyond that, but then to get the rest of us to be able to empathize with them, so that we can all reach our common goal of human flourishing.
Yeah, and for me, it's also like a mutual empathy too. So there's people who might have post-traumatic stress, and it's for them to maybe be empathized with, but for them to also have the opportunity to empathize with others as well, so that there's like this mutual empathy that gets created. I mean, that's kind of like my vision, or what I'd like to. So it's kind of what I'm kind of seeing is maybe the question is, how might we create a more empathic space together? Is maybe what we're looking for. Is how do we really connect with each other and create more empathy and more connection with each other, and overcome maybe the blocks to empathy, and maybe like trigger warnings could or this coercion or this correctness could be a block to actually empathizing more deeply and hearing each other more deeply.
Exactly, that's my argument. Although I think of course those who are proposing the trigger warnings are doing so for the same. They're trying to achieve the same goal that you and I are talking about here. I just think it's the wrong. I think not only is it the wrong way, but it ultimately works against the goal.
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, the way to really address that is then to bring together the people who are addressing wanting trigger warnings, and those who feel that that's not the right way to go, to have really an empathic dialogue about what are each of our needs. So it seems that might be the way forward to create more empathy together, is for those dialogues to happen.
Exactly, and as I said, I had a very valuable conversation with a student after this article came out, and I think other conversations are going on. She went on to write an article of her own, so there has been a lot of discussion, and other people have written about this phenomenon of trigger warnings in college courses besides me. So there is discussion going on, and I think it's all been very helpful and fruitful, and so it's an important discussion to have.
Mm-hmm. So maybe you're saying that you're kind of helping to initiate the conversation, or with the article.
Well, I am, and others too. I think it's an important enough issue to address. Again, the students who want the trigger warnings have raised a very, very important issue. I don't think that's the right solution, but by raising the issue, we're having these very important discussions.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can have a panel discussion online with some people who want trigger warnings and yourself, and actually have an empathic dialogue to
That's an excellent idea. And as a matter of fact, I did do a local radio program on the topic, and it just so happened that my niece from the West Coast was here in town, and so we began discussing it, and it turns out she's in college in Washington State, and she's majoring in human services, and she said all of her courses have always had warnings on the syllabus because she's used a lot of documentary films in her courses, or a lot of educational films dealing with domestic violence, abuse, rape, suicide, and those things. And she was very much in favor of these warnings, and we had a live discussion. I brought her to the radio station with me, and she had her say as well. And so it really was valuable for us to talk about why she thought they were important in her discipline, which is different from mine. And it was a very valuable discussion. So I think there's a lot of room for discussion from those. Again, I think that we all have the same concern at heart, but we just disagree on the best way to meet the need. And of course, students probably need a little bit more guidance, especially a generation that, as we've talked about, tends to be more coddled. So there may be a little bit of stretching that needs to go on there. But I do know for my colleagues in academia, I think there's a great room to improve in terms of creating a classroom environment where traumatized students can feel safe and can express their problems and really be heard and have their needs addressed. I'm not sure everyone is equipped to be able to do that. According to my students, they have not always had that.
Well, I think that's part of the coddling. Like a lot of times empathy gets confused with coddling. And I think there's a whole kind of discussion really around there too. It's like, what is the relationship of empathy and coddling? Because I think for me, they're different. They're different qualities, but that's probably a whole discussion in and of itself too. I mean, do you see empathy as naturally coddling, or is coddling just like overprotection? You know, I mean, they're really two different things.
If we go back to the definitions that I offered and that you expanded on, and if the core definition of empathy is identification, identification itself doesn't suggest coddling. Identification suggests being able to, well, as you said, identify the emotions and to understand the emotions, but coddling is simply one kind of response to those feelings, whereas there are many other kinds of responses that are possible and much more preferable to coddling. So to identify and understand is not to coddle.
Oh, that's my sense too.
It could be one response, but it's not the one we should take.
Well, I was just saying there was an example that you gave of E.J. Dionne and that Supreme Court. He had written something about the empathy test, and I didn't quite understand that. I was wondering what is the dynamics there of that of his article?
Right. Well, Dionne was arguing that the Supreme Court ruling that allows sectarian prayer in public town meetings fails what he called the empathy test, because it doesn't acknowledge sufficiently, in his opinion, the ability of someone to understand what it is like to be someone who is not in the religious majority. Which I think we do need to have empathy for such people. As a matter of fact, another article that I wrote following that decision was my own, and again, this is a very limited experience. It's just a microcosm of what those in a religious minority might feel. But I participate in yoga, which includes meditation, chanting, and prayer to beings other than the God that I worship. And so during class, I don't participate in those parts, while most of the people in my class do. And so it's just a tiny picture of what it's like for me to be a religious minority once a week in my yoga class. And so that helps me to have empathy with those who might be in that situation most of their lives. But I don't believe that our constitutional right to exercise our religion is not tied to our ability to empathize with the person next to us who might have a different religion. So it's into the place that empathy holds in a civilization, in the body politic. It cannot trump our laid out, written out rights, privileges, duties, and responsibilities. Because in the article I mentioned, I draw a parallel to a famous quote by Flannery O'Connor, who says that sentimentality always leads to the gas chamber. And what she means by that is that sentimentality is another form of feelings, of just having value for something because of our feelings. If that's all that there is, if there is no tying our feelings to just simply objective truth, rights, duties, responsibilities, then we can just do things based on how we feel. So when we see suffering, we feel bad and we want to end the suffering, and that leads us to the impulses that might advocate for infanticide, euthanasia, and those things. And not to get into those topics, but I think that I think that's dangerous because our feelings of empathy, our feelings in feeling bad for the suffering of someone else, can lead us to do something that really isn't right, just based on our feeling of empathy or sympathy.
Well, I think you kind of hit it there, that and I see this too, that there's a real difference between empathy and sympathy. You're almost using them interchangeably.
Yeah.
And for me, actually, sympathy is an inhibitory impulse that actually inhibits empathy. So, it's how I'm understanding it. So if I'm empathizing with someone who's suffering, I'm hearing what's going on, I'm seeing what's going on. And for me, the sympathy is like the secondary experience where I feel bad, I feel sorrow, I feel pain at their suffering. And that becomes almost like a bit in a way, a little narcissistic or self-indulgent, or it becomes a sense of, oh, it's about me and my feeling, and that actually causes my awareness to detach from the other person. So, if you look in the...
That's actually very helpful. That's a helpful distinction, and I completely agree with you, and I don't mean to conflate the terms, but that's my point exactly, is that empathy that turns into sympathy or something subjective and emotional rather than something more objective and external is the dangerous movement. So no, I agree with you. That's why empathy, so in other words, empathy is identification, but then what do we do once we have that identification? Do we coddle? Do we issue trigger warnings? Do we sympathize? And so empathy is the starting point, but apart from any further action, then it's just simply identification and understanding.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so you're seeing the difference too about that identification, so that we have a sense of agreement in terms of that. For me, I guess the way that I look at it is if I'm empathizing with someone and they're in distress or whatever, there's a sense of an empathic relationship that can be developed, in the sense of, like, I can say what's going on for me and have the other person empathize with me as well, that it becomes an ongoing a relationship. And I see this especially in conflict resolution, right? There's these two parties, they're totally mad at each other, they don't want to talk. You start empathizing with one party, and they start feeling heard, and they become more open, and then you ask them to start empathizing with each other, and you kind of facilitate the dialogue, and after a while they start really understanding each other. And then that empathic action, once that understanding happens, they come to kind of this deeper understanding of their common humanity, and then there's like this action that comes out of it. So in terms of that, that's kind of the way that I see empathy working. Is it's not just me empathizing with you, but looking for a mutual empathic relationship where you listen to what's going on for me and empathize with me, and that we keep dialoguing back and forth to come to a deeper, understanding and actually connection.
That's very helpful, and then that is in itself an action or a result. So that's very helpful.
Yeah, and sometimes people talk about empathy being neutral, and actually that sense of connection actually I think has a healing quality in itself. That, hey, this feels pretty good. It's like, it's like feeling connected with someone else is like it has a great feeling and reduces stress. And I even the neuroscientists, they actually say that the pleasure centers of the brain light up when we really resonate with each other.
That makes a great deal of sense. It's very illuminating.
Okay, so then the other part was you'd mentioned David Brooks. Oh, and the other part was about the relationship. You'd mentioned David Brooks' article, The Limits of Empathy. And in a sense, he's making the case like he's taking empathy into, sentimentality and sympathy, it seems to me. And then he says we need to use rules, conventions, and so forth. I think that's kind of the case that you were making as well.
Right. Yeah, I was really just echoing what Brooks reported on in a study that came out that showed that that the limits of empathy, as he called it. It may be that what you just described as the action that results, the connection is a kind of action, it is a kind of movement as a result of empathic understanding. That's very nuanced and I think helpful, and maybe something that's missing from the previous discussions of empathy and the distinction between empathy and sympathy. I think those are, and sentimentality, those are important to draw out. And I did try to distinguish between them in my article, but there's also, I think, a lot of overlap, and this whole problem with trigger warnings actually makes it harder to distinguish between them, which is why it's such an important discussion to have, I think.
So what I'm kind of hearing is that there's these deeper nuanced experiences that we're needing to look at, and that the part about the empathic action is something that you're feeling is relevant.
Yes, exactly. So, for example, in the David Brooks article, where he cites the example of the Nazi soldiers crying when they were executing women and children and so forth, maybe that wasn't empathy, it was actually sympathy, according to the terms that you've talked about. So, fleshing out these nuances, I think, is important and helpful.
Yeah, and that also comes in because I know David Brooks was and even Paul Bloom. You mentioned mentioned him too, is they're talking about, well, we need these conventions and, you know, these rights and kind of basically these rules and laws for morality. And in that sense, I kind of wonder about this, in the sense that, if, you know, that story about the Nazi concentration camp, right? That there was rules and regulations, but those rules and regulations were geared towards the lack of empathy, like they were geared towards abuse of people. So it seems to me that saying, hey, we need rules and regulations, that in and of itself, those rules and regulations, if they're devoid of empathy, that they are not, you know, that they can be just as abusive or even, you know, as anything else.
That's a good point. There was a moral code in the Nazi regime. It was just an immoral one, and it was divorced, as you point out, from empathy. So, yeah, I don't think that there is a magic solution that laws and codes offer alone, or that empathy offers alone. So it's important that people like you are really looking at empathy and what it is and its role and what its value is, and others that are looking at the limits. And then we have discussions like these, and I think that are very, very productive.
Yeah, I'm enjoying the discussion too. That I'm hearing that you're finding it's the dialogue. It's like the empathic dialogue that can be the productive of bringing together these different understandings.
Right.
Yeah. So the one thing I wonder what you would think about that, that we could actually, that the two can actually merge. I mean, it's something I've been thinking about. I wonder what your thoughts are. That the rules and empathy can actually merge, in the sense that we can say that we have a rule that we try to foster more empathy.
Right, exactly. And trigger warnings won't do that, so then we need to have a different rule, which in my rule would be don't coddle, but provide a safe, nurturing environment for all students, or whatever what other contexts we might be talking about, because we have to face the reality of more and more people who are coming to terms with whatever trauma it is that they might have experienced. Those things aren't, even if the rate of incidence isn't changing, the rate of people facing and dealing with them rather than hiding them has increased. Mm-hmm. So we need to be equipped to help people through those things.
So you're concerned, what I'm hearing is concerned about people really sharing what's going on for them instead of hiding and coddling the true feelings that they're experiencing, and you're looking for ways of how do we connect to those true, honest experiences.
Right, which for me is exactly what great literature does. I mean, that's why I study literature. I started out in college as a social work major and switched to English, but don't feel like I really changed my core values and concerns, because I think that literature gives us the whole range of human experience and opens a door for us to empathize with others by reading about those experiences, and of course the classroom discussion that takes place in the college environment fosters even more potential empathy and connection.
So it sounds like actually literature, I think you made the point there too, that literature is actually a gateway to empathy. I mean, I think you mentioned studies or whatever, that by reading literature, it's kind of transporting you into someone else's experience, which is creating that empathy. And it sounds like that's a real value of yours, is using those dialogues to come to like a deeper truth.
Right. There was another Atlantic article. I should have thought to send it to you, but I didn't ahead of time. But I wrote last year where I was responding to some warring research findings about whether or not reading literature makes us more moral. And I argued that that's really not the point, whether it does or doesn't, that really what reading literature does is simply make us more human, because of what you were just talking about, because being human entails strengths and weaknesses and empathy and selfishness, and literature opens all those doors to expose us to those things in other people and therefore in ourselves, and it's just a way of tapping into all those wonderful, glorious, and horrible things that make us human. We're very complex creatures. What a mighty maze is man, right? That's what literature shows us, and I think that's the greatest value.
Okay, so well, what I'm hearing there basically is that trigger warnings, you feel, kind of inhibit that empathic connection and actually having dialogues using maybe literature as a gateway into dialogues in the human condition. Is that's the way that we can connect and learn and grow and empathize more deeply with each other?
Exactly, exactly.
Am I kind of getting that? Well, do you have other ideas about how instead of trigger warnings, you're seeing that as an impediment to empathy, what else can we do to create more empathy, like in the classroom and in other environments? Like if we are working together with our intention of creating more connection and empathy, what else can we do, or what have you seen that's worked well?
Well, something that that might be seen as sort of a compromise view is because I teach in a conservative Christian university, I've actually been in the habit for a long time of, at the beginning of the semester, just sort of giving a sort of general disclaimer. Not necessarily a trigger warning for a specific book or a specific incident in a book, but just generally making a defense or an apology for why we read literary works that might be disturbing or challenging, and what we gain out of that in general to prepare students to be challenged. And so I think that sets up an entire environment where students have an expectation of being challenged, and that way I'm not assuming, how could I even assume, getting back to the trigger warnings, how could I even know what particular event or what particular work is going to trigger something in another student? I really have no idea. So if we talk about these things in general terms when they do come up, then hopefully I've built an environment of trust so that students know they can either come to me outside of class or bring ideally even bring something up in class. And so I've never really had a problem with students feeling like they can do that. So rather than a trigger warning, just a general foundation or rationale for what it is that we'll be doing in a particular course. I think that's something I've been doing for a long time, and I have found is very helpful.
Yeah, maybe like an intention, an empathy intention. Like our intention is to empathize more deeply with each other. We want to empathize with each other, hear each other's stories, hear each other's, our lives, as well as use literature to empathize with, the greater humanity or something like that. So that would be my suggestion.
Right, and leave ourselves open to being moved or being made ill, even. I mean, there may be something that we read that just reveals some dark side of human nature, and it should disturb us. And so, again, without going over into that line of coddling.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's
well, in that sense, I'm actually there with you. It's just that there's a container to hold that if somebody is disturbed and feeling stressed, that instead of withdrawing, that they have a space where they can share their distress and for their distress to be heard. And that's actually kind of the healing agent, is if you are distressed, the healing happens, or the connection happens through that being heard and kind of accepted, I guess.
Absolutely, I agree with you, and that's what we should be striving for.
Well, you mentioned it's a conservative Christian college. That's my background too, evangelical Christian Baptist.
Okay, then you know what I'm talking about.
That's how I know that world. That's the kind of the world that I come out of.
You can empathize with me.
I can empathize with that environment, and I do a lot of talking with my family around the notion of empathy, and we've actually started doing empathy circles, so doing empathic listening with each other. Using kind of more reflective, empathic listening. It's been very connecting for us. So, well, this is great. I did want to talk a bit about your empathy in animals work. Do you want to share a little bit about that before we?
Right. Well, I do serve on the Faith Advisory Council for the Humane Society of the United States, which of course is the nation's largest animal welfare organization, and so that's another area where I'm not sure. Maybe you can help me. I'm not sure if empathy is the right term or sympathy, But basically, the animal welfare movement, a lot of people don't know this, but the animal welfare movement was started by 19th century evangelical Christians in England. The same Christians who were fighting for the abolition of slavery were at the same time advocating humane treatment for animals, because they saw this as all as part of one large package of societal reform. They saw slavery and the commonplace animal cruelty around them, and the cruelty toward the laboring classes and the workers, as all a kind of barbarism that pervaded their society. And the word that they used at that time was benevolence, which is perhaps that similar. I mean, it really means goodwill. They wanted to cultivate a society of benevolence toward all fellow creatures, fellow human beings, slaves, animals, and they were very successful. And so in serving with the Humane Society of the United States, I feel like I am continuing that legacy of my evangelical forebears in cultivating a sense of benevolence or empathy for the lower creatures. That doesn't mean that I believe that animals actually have rights or have the same rights that human beings have, but I do believe that human beings have the duty and obligation to keep in mind the suffering of animals and to do all that we can to alleviate that. And so I'm not sure what connections you can draw between that work of mine and what we've been talking about, but I would love to hear what you have to say about it.
Mm. Well, I've seen studies about that. Children who maybe abused animals, that they were more likely to abuse, others. So
right.
It seems to be an underlying callousness towards life and the experience of others. So that by cultivating that sense of care for and maybe understanding and empathy with animals, or maybe even nature in general, that leads to a deeper connection with others too, and having like a sense of callousness and disconnection for the animals will lead to that same callousness and disconnection from others.
Right. No, that connection has long been established, and that's an excellent point that I'm glad that you brought up. So I think that there is a connection. Empathy is just one of those things. I guess it's like love. It never runs out, and the more you learn how to exercise that, the more you can apply it, I think, to all situations.
Well, there's a lot of science coming out now, or studies about empathy in animals. There's the I don't know if you've seen the work of Franz de Waal. He's a primatologist, and he looks at the different aspects of empathy in animals. Like there's within the brain, there's different. Like I laid out those different parts of empathy.
Right.
And the dogs might have that mirroring empathy, but they don't have the perspective taking, which happens when if you look in the mirror, that you have that, you realize that it's you in the mirror. Like if a dog looks in the mirror, they don't know it's them.
Right.
And a child until 18 months, they look in the mirror and they don't really know that that's them. And then at some point they realize, oh, that is me. And that self-awareness seems to be the key to having that imaginative empathy. Like, oh, I'm a separate being, so I can imagine myself in your situation. And chimpanzees, dolphins, elephants, other animals like that have that self-awareness that they will recognize themselves in a mirror. So they have these different levels of empathy as well within their own relationships as well. So I guess that's something that comes to mind.
We do have a lot to learn from animals, and a lot to learn about how we relate to them, I believe. Especially, a lot of, unfortunately, animal welfare is seen in contemporary America. Contemporary American evangelicalism is something that belongs to other groups, not an issue of concern to us. But I think that those who would claim responsibility to be good stewards of God's earth have the utmost responsibility to be good stewards of His animal creation and all of creation. Empathy is an important part of that.
Yeah, and it's also what I'm really looking at is to get the different sides. You know, the evangelical. Since I have that background, I've since kind of moved away. You know, more kind of in the atheistic, you know, atheist kind of mode. But I think,
I think you moved to the other side of the planet there.
yeah, but for me, it's really about dialogue. You know, it's really what I really value is the connection, especially when you know, when I have my family who are all evangelicals and, you know, Baptist, evangelical, conservative evangelical. That, you know, it's really about creating that connection, and I find that when we really create that dialogue to really hear each other and create that space, that there's a, you know, we really come to see our common, you know, our common humanity and that connection. So I'm really looking at how do we create that in all the environments. We have this terrible political divide, you know, with the Democrats and Republicans, and it's just they're not really dialoguing and empathizing with each other, and so we need you know, a movement to create that space and that value of empathy, so that people start dialoguing with each other, because I really see that as the way forward.
Yeah, I mean, maybe empathy is just another word for God with us, right? God's image in us, and we all have that, and that's what we should be looking for and seeking to cultivate.
Yeah, and maybe I mean, that's why I kind of wanted to kind of talk to you. But one thing is that when we start getting these new terms out there around like empathic correctness, or whatever it was, empathically correct, is to, you know, dialogue about that. That I think, I mean, if we really looked at the terms of what you're looking at, you know, for me, it's not the empathy that is the empathically correct. It's the, you know, it's the coddling, it's the cutting off, right. It's the disconnection. Which is all part of the correctness.
And
that's the correctness part, yeah.
Right, it doesn't work. You can't have coerced empathy.
Yeah,
it's a contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
Right.
So great. This is I really enjoyed this. I was looking forward to dialoguing with you around this. Maybe we can even have an empathy circle. We do something for conflicts, is bring people who are really in opposing step in opposing camps or whatever, and have them come together and dialogue. But we use something called empathic listening, using kind of the rephrasing, the reflecting what you hear the other person say before you share your piece, and that really kind of helps with the conflict. So maybe we could talk about that for some, you know, if you have someone who's really in the trigger, using trigger warnings camp, maybe we could have like an empathy circle around that, if you're up for that.
That's a good idea. I have one person in mind who's sort of, that I mentioned, who's had trauma and is undecided on the trigger warnings, but maybe we could find another person who's for the trigger warnings, and that would be a very valuable discussion to have.
Oh, so, great.
Let's do that.
Well, this is so fun. Yay. I enjoyed this.
My first Google talk. Yay, I did it.
Yeah, it worked really well, I think. So, okay, Karen, thank you so much, and we'll be in contact. Really enjoyed it.
Okay,